Meep.
The streaming era has made it almost impossible to ignore just how dominant true crime is in our media landscape. It seems like every few months, another show or movie in the genre emerges and grabs everyone's attention, even if only for a brief moment. And yet, somehow, nearly 6 years since it ended, I still find myself thinking about Mindhunter more than any other true crime project. I watched seasons 1 and 2 the moment they each premiered, back in 2017 and 2019 respectively, and I loved them both. But until recently, I had never actually re-watched either of them, especially after season 3 got put on indefinite hiatus. I just didn't see the point. But that hasn't stopped my vague but positive memory of the show from lingering in the back of my mind, and for an obvious reason, that vague memory really started gnawing at me over the course of the past few months. Yeah, I've certainly been more than critical of true crime on this channel. It's no secret that I have a lot of inherent issues with the genre, namely the ways in which it exploits and distorts real-life tragedy for entertainment. But that viewpoint hasn't been with me at every single moment of my life. Like anyone else, my tastes and preferences have changed a lot over the years, which really made me begin to question that positive memory I had of Mindhunter. Like, was it really that good? So good that I could overlook my issues with its genre? Would it stand the test of time, or would I walk away with an entirely different point of view? Well, I have now re-watched both seasons 1 and 2, and I gotta say, Mindhunter is even better than I thought it was. In fact, I believe that it is still the best true crime anything ever made, and it's not even close. It may never be close. There are many easily apparent things one could point to in order to argue that Mindhunter is a quality show. Things like the excellent cinematography, the precise and calculated editing, the stellar performances from pretty much every actor across the entire series, and the confident directing not just from David Fincher, but from every other director involved. The thing is, though, is that most of these qualities are not too dissimilar to another true crime show that I've been heavily critical of in the past, that being the Netflix Dahmer series, which I promise I will not talk about for the rest of the video. But still, despite the obvious high bar set by the technical elements, the thing that immediately stuck out to me about Mindhunter compared to its counterparts was the fact that it is not entirely grounded in reality. While the serial killers being interviewed and many of the crimes being investigated are directly based on real-life cases, the three characters at the center of the show are not, at least not fully. Holden, Tench, and Dr. Carr are loosely based on real FBI agents, but they are not and do not pretend to be one-to-one representations of the people that they are based on. This gives the writers a clear advantage in so much as it allows them to write these characters however they want, without any obligation to accuracy. But I think the advantages of this approach run even deeper. One of my biggest complaints with true crime in general, that I've talked about to death, is that it is inherently reductive.
Why do I get the sense that reductive is your worst insult?
It compresses reality down to something more digestible. This is a necessary process for any show or movie which is based on true events, that's undeniable, but it's not hard to see how this starts to get really messy when dealing with real-life crimes and tragedy, especially if the show touts itself as an accurate representation of factual events. It's essentially a tightrope act. focus too much on the killers and you risk glorifying or mythologizing them. But conversely, if you focus too broadly on the events at large, or even myopically on just one person, you risk losing the full emotional impact of the story. Mindhunter perfectly walks the line by centering itself around its ensemble of fictional FBI agents. It focuses its attention on literal and figural outside observers as opposed to those directly impacted by the crimes, giving viewers a clear perspective through which to view the events of the series, entirely dictating what we are and are not allowed to see, which, in turn, guides us on how to view stories like these, all of which I'll get into later. But first and foremost, it signals to the audience that this show is not a presentation of factual information. Despite the diligent research and commitment to accuracy that Mindhunter presents, the show itself is actually more akin to historical fiction. I think this gives Mindhunter an ethical advantage over other true crime shows which attempt to play it more straight. It allows the scenes to just be scenes instead of hamstrung references to reality, and that works even as an audience member because you don't have to get quite as bogged down in constant comparisons to the real-life story. The clearly signaled narrativization gives the audience permission to explore these crimes in a way that keeps them at a safe distance from the full brunt of uncompromised reality, without feeling reductive because the show itself is acknowledging its distance from reality and incorporating that in an intelligent way. And yet, somehow, despite the show's clear fictionality, it manages to keep the hard-hitting emotional impact of the many tragedies it explores because the facts of the murder cases remain mostly true to life, which is all the more impressive considering, again, that the three central characters that we are following are criminal investigators who are mostly looking at these murders from the outside in. Now, I do need to address the possibility that there are some people out there who are not me speaking directly into a microphone that might suggest that, hypothetically, the FBI is allegedly not the most ethical branch of government in the world.
The last time the FBI wiretapped a black man in Georgia, it was not well received.
With all respect, sir, Wayne Williams is no Dr. King.
And that perhaps centering the show around FBI agents isn't entirely an ethical choice. Propaganda, one might say. I'm not saying that, especially not directly into this microphone, but I do think it's worth considering that how the show chooses to portray its fictional FBI agents could potentially dissuade this entirely hypothetical argument. See, making the main characters fictional doesn't just let the show off the hook for accuracy. It also removes the obligation to make the main characters look like the quote-unquote good guys. And the writers use this freedom to explore the many shortcomings and outright moral failures of the FBI's behavioral science unit, as well as other forms of systemic corruption that go hand in hand with their investigations, in a way that is more clear than strict adherence to reality would allow for. Information that took years to uncover can be condensed into mere moments. Opposing viewpoints can be espoused by any character at any time, and all of the factors that led to crimes remaining unsolved or even flatly ignored can be clearly laid out. This is especially true of the Atlanta cases in Season 2, which repeatedly expose how forms of corruption like systemic racism,
The city doesn't provide the same level of services to all neighborhoods.
wealth-driven bureaucracy,
They're trying to keep the noise down. High murder rate, even the whisper of a predator. That shit scares dollars away.
internal cover-ups,
Somebody from APD knew we should have been looking at these guys all along.
and many other intentionally upheld forms of discrimination, ultimately culminated into a killer, or maybe even multiple killers, never seeing justice, and a community never receiving the closure that they deserved, while also being a testament to the resilience, self-advocacy, and well-organized resistance of said community. But don't get it twisted, this is a compressed and more digestible version of reality, one which often keeps the audience from being aware that they are theoretically directly engaging with the corruption the show is condemning. But with Mindhunter, I'm not as quick to disparage this as I would be otherwise, because again, the show is directly addressing its condensing of reality and accentuating its fictional nature. But it doesn't feel like the show is just doing this to hand wave away any criticism either. In fact, quite the opposite. To me, it's actually highlighting the criticism by using it as an inextricable piece of its design, enhancing the real-life stories rather than reducing them by fully utilizing the 2020 hindsight and ethical consideration that other narrative approaches wouldn't have reasonably allowed for, all while somewhat paradoxically still keeping you at the story's emotional center. If there's one thing that's important above all else in a true crime show, it's perspective, both how the story is being framed and by who. Again, the center of Mindhunter is the main trio of fictional FBI agents, Holden, Tench, and Dr. Carr. The brilliance of having them at the center of the story is that they give us, as the audience, a good way to keep ourselves grounded. The behavioral science unit's job is to analyze and interview killers, and then hopefully be able to apply their findings to active crimes. And as such, they act as a sort of middle ground for the story to take place in. We're not overly preoccupied with the past or with the distant future, but nearly always focused on the here and now. Uncovered truths from the past and pending revelations in the immediate future could reveal themselves at any moment, and you have to really pay attention so as not to miss any detail. And in that way, we are just like the characters, analyzing every angle and waiting for each layer of a case to get peeled back. But we also aren't overly attached to any singular way of viewing things. The brilliance of the ensemble is that it still respects the viewer's autonomy. It allows for each moral quandary in the show to be thoroughly explored, since each fictional character can be made to represent a distinct viewpoint, which also allows for each person watching the show to draw their own conclusions. Tench is the straight man, the prototypical emotionally repressed American father, who often represents the idea that there's nothing to learn from serial killers. He's only interested in learning their behavior as a means to an end, as a way to put monsters behind bars. Dr. Wendy Carr, of course, represents the academic view. She's interested in data and patterns, sometimes in sort of a cold way, but is also, at the same time, often more compassionate than her cohorts. And she's also obviously a woman, but also a lesbian, which allows her to argue against many harmful stereotypes that those around her throw into their profiling.
Cross-dressing is part of his psychology, his fixation on women's clothes, women's bodies, wanting to own them, wanting to inhabit them. If we can understand that, we can recognize it in another killer.
Cross-dressing is not an antecedent to homicidal behavior.
I didn't say that.
For most people, it's a harmless form of expression.
Most people.
Those who do it.
Sexuality is relevant as far as it pertains to victimology, like their obvious preference for males, but it's not causal to violence.
Homosexuality is a deviance.
Actually, it's been removed from the DSM as a disorder and changed to a sexual orientation disturbance.
Sounds much better.
And lastly, there is arguably the main character of Mindhunter, Holden Ford, who represents detached fascination.
Why do you keep looking at me like that?
Like what?
funny. You keep looking at me like I'm a specimen.
He's someone who is enamored by human behavior, but especially the behavior of the compulsive serial killers that he interviews. Holden is extremely neurodivergent coded.
Do you ever feel like you're on the cusp of something major and it just keeps spinning out in your head?
Where did you get that ironing board?
Your closet. I just can't stop thinking about this project. The idea is so exciting.
Something I'll talk more about in a bit. And his unique brand of thinking allows him to offer insights that others wouldn't normally think of, typically to their annoyance, especially when Holden uses these insights to bolster his self-importance. Each of these characters offers valuable insight, but the information they have on hand is often not enough to come to any definitive conclusions. And with speculation abound, you, as the spectator, really need to consider every single one of the perspectives that gets thrown out there, because there's little elements and versions of the truth found within each of them. Each case proves that nothing can be boiled down simply, especially as more wrenches get thrown in the works. It's sort of remarkable that the show is able to have characters that are so well defined and easy to invest in, while also making sure that I'm never unaware of my own presence while watching them. No matter what, I knew that no one in a given situation was 100% correct, and I needed to be wary of that at all times. Now personally, I relate the most to Holden. While I won't get into specifics, Holden is definitely the same brand of neurodivergent as me. I see this in his obsession and fixation, his drive, his constant struggle to not be misunderstood, his fascination with human behavior that he himself cannot always fully embody, his difficulty in maintaining personal relationships, and, if I may be so bold, his keen intellect and wit. And there's no better way that I can explain how damn good the character writing is in this show than to point out that my ability to project myself onto Holden doesn't absolve him of accountability. It is human to want to defend someone we see ourselves in, even if that someone is fictional. But Holden is clearly in the wrong a lot of the time. He doesn't know how to draw boundaries between himself and his subjects. His rigidity in his thinking often leaves him blind to his own ignorance, and he crosses many ethical lines over the course of the series. Though I empathize with Holden the whole way through, I'd be hard-pressed to say that this show is tacit endorsement of him, regardless of how effective his methods can be at times. Again, it goes back to what I said earlier, giving the audience a way into the story while still respecting their autonomy. It's a rare moment where having your cake and eating it too actually can work, where empathy and exploration don't have to cross into mythology or oversimplification. I can feel heavily for the characters and get enveloped in their personal lives and drama. I can walk away from the series with a bit more understanding of what drives a person to commit heinous acts of violence, and even learn more about the lives and efforts of the people impacted by these crimes. I can do all of that without the show having to pretend to make any grand proclamations of truth. The story is written to be nuanced, even conflicting, and still leave a devastating impact, because the conflict I was feeling was the same conflict being harbored by the characters the show chose to focus on. It makes the real-life stories feel more personal, as the sickening details of crimes were recounted, as victims' families grieved, as the pressure mounted on solving the different cases, and as an answer to each question only begged more questions. I could feel all of that in an incredibly visceral way because these characters felt all of that. It seems like writing 101, but it's something that many true crime shows forget. The choice of perspective facilitates the emotion. They are inseparable. But a limited perspective isn't just about what you see. It's just as much about what you don't see. One of the most underrated aspects of Mindhunter's approach is how often the show chooses to strategically omit things. For example, when Holden and Tench interview serial killers, we are never fully let into the killer's head via visualization. It is always a conversation that is contained to one room, and this is entirely by design, as Holden and Tench have no clear path into the killer's head either. It's the entire point of the show. But it would have been really easy to have quick cutaways to recreations of the crimes that each killer is describing in order to heighten the tension. And it would have also been just as easy to visualize the traumatic memories the killers had for the sake of the audience's understanding. But the show never does either of those things. It also never fully recreates any of the murders, even during active cases. The most we get are gruesome crime scene photos, often with faces obscured, focusing on specific details rather than the crime as a whole. I think many people go into a show like this expecting to see horrific violence and detailed recreations of crimes that they can project themselves onto. But Mindhunter does not indulge this at all. It is always keeping the audience at a distance from both victim and perpetrator. If the goal were to show reality as it happened, doing that would be a monumental disservice to the story. But again, since the presentation is centered around self-admitted fictionality, a lot more leeway can be given. Obviously, I'd still love to see one of these big-budget studio true crime shows take a victim-centric approach.
This is where your focus should be. Not on the crime scene, not on the corpse, not on the schematics.
And this show is certainly not that, but at least it has the decency to mostly leave them out of it. Sometimes we do get stories from the victims' families, and that's usually more than enough to feel the devastation, especially during the Atlanta cases in Season 2, as mentioned earlier. Or of course, there's also the masterful scene where Tench interviews Kevin Bright, a real-life survivor of the BTK killer. It is one of the most gut-wrenching sequences in the entire series, and it doesn't even so much as show the face of the actor who plays Kevin. The consistent obscuring of Kevin's face makes way for his story of survival to be recounted in detail, using the camera's lens to focus attention away from performance and onto the very real pain in his every word. Which just goes to show that there is never a need to over-dramatize any of this. The killers recounting their crimes through dialogue alone made my skin crawl as is. The crime scene photos left more up to my imagination, which was profoundly disturbing, and I felt the pain of loss without having to literally watch it happen. Leaving an air of mystery isn't just about entertainment or suspense either. It's also about providing the right context for what you are watching. Keeping the audience on their toes reminds them that the show is not to be engaged with at face value. You can't take any of the killer's stories to heart. You can't assume that there's a singular cause for tragedy in the world, and you can't trust that the people and systems tasked with solving these crimes aren't motivated by their own self-interest. Serial murders can't be understood so simply, and visualizing every single event that took place in one show would risk feeling contrived. Instead, we're given just enough information to make judgments without being able to fully trust them, because any hasty judgment or rigid belief could be turned on us at any moment. Given that Mindhunter as a show is entirely preoccupied with the origins of criminal psychology and profiling, it makes sense that the show delves into psychoanalysis. As more serial killers get interviewed, we learn more about how their experience informs their behavior. But a sly trick that the show pulls is that the more we learn to read the killers, the more we also learn to read our main characters. Through exposition, performance, and editing, the show essentially teaches the viewer how to read each character's tells, to the point where even a simple cutaway to a facial expression reveals everything you need to know about a character's state of mind.
I've spent enough time with Holden that I know what it means when he gets that crazy look in his eyes.
As we dive deeper into each character's personal life, we learn more about why they've come to represent the viewpoints that they espouse in their analysis of criminals, exposing their personal vendettas and bias.
Some people are uncomfortable.
You are. You are uncomfortable, Agent Ford. Why is that?
I am advising you to hear the concerns of your teachers and your school board.
You didn't know what the hell you were doing that day. You still don't. Deviant, torture, mutilation. That is your world, and it has made you paranoid. That is not my school.
I feel like this becomes most clear with Bill Tench after his adopted son Brian becomes culpable for a murder in season 2. This is a pressing issue for a character like Tench because he's always assumed himself to be fully outside of these kind of crimes. He's able to easily dismiss each killer as a sick freak who got what they deserved. But now the criminal is in his own backyard. Suddenly, interviews become a lot more personal.
I always let children go. If he falls, that is how he learns. You become strong by falling.
You're not supposed to let children fall, you're supposed to guide them.
Guide them into what? Guide them into what you've guided them into?
You fucking midgets.
How do you feel about those murders? That's what counts. Happened in your world, not in mine.
And his interjections in meetings suddenly become more sympathetic to criminals than they've ever been before.
We have to consider Henley was a kid. He might view his participation as having been beyond his control.
He knew exactly what was going to happen to the victims he procured, and he made a conscious decision not to intervene. So whether he participated or not, he's culpable.
I'm not excusing him. I'm just asking, can a teenager be held responsible for the actions of an adult?
He needs to believe that there's a difference between his son and the killers he interviews. He has to convince himself that he can set things right. The real-life investigator that Bill Tench is based on never had a son who exhibited latent serial killer-like behavior. It's an entirely made-up storyline, but one that enhances the real-life story in an incredible way. It humanizes Tench for both good and bad, reminding us of the emotional impacts of crimes like these while also showing the difficulty of directly navigating them.
Was this inside him when we got him? Or did we do something?
Bill, I know you. You didn't do this to him.
So this might just be who he is.
Everyone, every single person in a story like this is, or tragically was, a human being. The victims, the investigators, and yes, even the killers. But the show never asks you to feel bad for a real-life serial killer like Ed Kemper. It asks you to feel for Brian, a fictional character, allowing you to explore what makes someone exhibit these kinds of behaviors in a way that does not blatantly cross ethical boundaries. And it asks you to feel for Bill Tench while also fully acknowledging how his personal failings, like his physical and emotional distancing from his family, contribute to his struggles. Even without asking the audience to bear the full burden of reality, Mindhunter still doesn't allow the comfort of a clear-cut story about good guys and bad guys, and it doesn't allow the audience to be entertained by all of this without asking them to do some serious self-reflection. The greatest trick Mindhunter pulls is, in many ways, turning its prospective audience against itself. There's a sort of meta-narrative being constructed all throughout the show, and I say that mainly because our central characters find themselves driven by the very same impulse that makes people want to watch a show like this. A complete and utter fascination with serial killers, wanting to understand what made them become the way they are, why they did the things they did. It's a natural curiosity, but it's also one that Mindhunter does not allow to go unchecked. This is especially the case with Holden, the one who essentially spearheads the entire concept of interviewing convicted killers. His attraction to understanding these killers on the surface seems to come from a relatively noble and pure place. He wants to understand killers in order to be able to identify and predict patterns of behavior, in the hopes that this type of profiling will allow these killers to be caught before they become infamous. But he also, oddly, seems to have a childlike wonder and naivety about the entire thing, and as the techniques he develops prove to be successful, his interest reveals itself to be somewhat self-serving.
Bill, my God. We're vindicated. What's the matter with you? An old lady was just murdered.
Which proves to be a pretty deadly concoction. He's so enamored by the killers and so sure of his methodology that he starts to completely let his guard down. It doesn't take long for his noble fascination to become an obsession, and combined with his inability to draw boundaries in his work, it starts to become apparent how self-destructive this type of fascination can be, especially throughout Season 1. His personal relationships start to erode. He indulges in overconfidence. He crosses ethical lines and jeopardizes the integrity of his work. But even more frightening than any of that, he starts to view his own life through the minds of his subjects. He lets these killers influence him in many of the ways he was afraid would happen.
I can't let these guys rub off on me. The way they view sex.
And women.
Maybe I don't always want to hear your opinion.
You mean when I'm not in agreement with you?
Could you just be my girlfriend? Could you just listen?
You mean shut up and adore you?
Well, you could try it. Once.
And ultimately, once it seems like everything is imploding around him, he puts himself in mortal danger. He visits the co-ed killer, Ed Kemper, in the hospital, for reasons that he can't even begin to understand, and ends up in the most vulnerable position imaginable. In a scene like the one where Holden gets hugged by Kemper, all the tension and disturbing feelings that are evoked don't feel like they are purely in service of entertainment. Instead, it gets under your skin in a much more visceral and challenging way. It's hard not to see it as a cautionary tale to the average true crime viewer, a firm reminder that obsession is not protection. There are so many threats to our safety in this world, so much what we would call evil, that it drives many people to obsessively try and understand it, which often comes with it a false sense of security. Holden is much the same. His drive to understand these killers is a form of defense, both for his own ego and the world at large. He believes that if he can understand the warning signs thoroughly enough, that he can stop murders from happening.
I think I should be allowed a single day to
predict if someone might commit a crime? Who are you, the fucking thought police?
Knowledge is his shield, his mask, his sense of security. So much so that the most vulnerable thing he says in the entire series is,
"Why are you here, Holt?"
I don't know.
Well, now. That is the truth.
Holden's meticulous, theoretical understanding of serial killers' behavior didn't guarantee his safety, nor could it ever guarantee the safety of everyone around him, especially given how his fixation on these killers caused him to overlook many other threats to both his own and others' livelihoods. Because the horrors of the world aren't only where we choose to look for them, they're everywhere. And no one, like 99% of us, are not guaranteed protection from them, which in the context of a true crime show is a shockingly profound thing to ask your audience to consider, and sort of epitomizes the entire approach of the show. Leave no stone unturned and allow for all the stones that get turned over to be looked at from every angle, inviting you to pause and reflect, not just on the sometimes dark and foreboding corners of the world we live in, but also on yourself and your place within that world. Which really, at the end of the day, is proof positive of how truly special Mindhunter is, both then, now, and probably forever. The only thing I don't love about this show is, well, the poorly aged CGI during the car crash scene, or whatever the hell was going on with the marching scene in Season 2, Episode 7. But aside from those things, the only other thing I could possibly complain about is that the show never received a proper conclusion. It ends on quite a stark and harrowing note, which I think is completely appropriate for a show like this, but remarkably, even given how much thought and detail went into the 2 seasons we got, there's still so much more that could be explored or expanded upon. So many stones left to turn, and a true crime landscape that is desperately in need of a show this carefully considered, emotionally stirring, and demanding of its audience.
I'm trying to warn you, your attitude is gonna bite you in the ass.
Developing a pattern of behavior that will not sustain you. Who are you, thought police?